Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Gabrielle, Emmanuel, welcome. How's it going?
It's good. It's good to be here.
So, you are a WBUR Senior Health and Science reporter, and we got you here because we are going to be talking about birth control, because regulators are currently considering whether to make birth control available over the counter in the U.S. And if it's approved, that will be a pretty big deal in the history of this medication.
Yes.
And you recently reported that the birth control pill can trace its roots back to Massachusetts and not too far from Boston. I want to get into that with you, but first, just talk to us about the effort to make birth control available without a prescription.
Sure. So as you said, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is deciding whether to take birth control over the counter. And this is the culmination of a nearly 20-year effort that all started in Harvard Square. That's where the first meeting to launch this campaign happened back in 2004. It is now a big nationwide coalition that's pushing this. And they essentially argue that the need for a prescription creates an unnecessary barrier for people who have limited resources or difficulty accessing a medical provider. They also say this medication is extremely well tested and pretty simple to use, such that you don't need the oversight of a physician or a clinician to take it.
Okay, so we're going to get into that. But first, let's go on a little journey through history. So, like I mentioned, the origins of oral birth control start right here in Massachusetts. Tell us about that.
Yes. So go back in your mind to the 1950s. This is the baby boom. This is a kind of a golden age for drug development. And there are two particularly important researchers, scientists here in Massachusetts that make the pill possible. One is a guy named John Rock, and he is this renowned infertility specialist in Brookline. And people came from all over the world to seek his care. People wanted his help in getting pregnant. And he had a theory that the problem with his patients, the reason they weren't conceiving, was because they had a underdeveloped reproductive system. That's what he called it. And he proposed giving them hormones that would let their system rest and then kind of reboot. I should say he was very ahead of his time. He gave patients full information about the study, full consent. The patients knew this might not work. And that was not normal for the time, which is important to keep in mind for the rest of the history where things get a little sketchy. The other person involved was a biologist named Gregory Pincus. He was known as Goody. And he was a man who was known to be incredibly smart. His family considered him a genius, they say. But he was kind of on the outs. He had done in vitro fertilization in a rabbit, and that was an extremely controversial idea at this time. And partly because of that, he didn't get tenure at Harvard. He ended up moving to the Worcester area, and that is where he started looking for oral contraceptives.
Wow. So you mentioned that Rock initially was trying to help people get pregnant. How did the pill become the pill if that was the origin?
Exactly, right? So Pincus was working to rebuild his career, and he was working out of this converted barn, trying to scrape together money and funding. And he ended up getting backing from these very prominent feminists, including Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood, and others. And they basically had a directive to him, which was find oral birth control. He started testing some hormones on women and men at a state mental hospital. Highly controversial. Did not get the patient's consent, although did have their family's consent. But this is the key point. Pincus was looking for oral birth control with the exact same hormones that Rock was using to treat his infertile patients. And they started teaming up, and they looked at the uterine tissue of Rock's patients, and they discovered that none of the patients were ovulating. So this essentially was birth control.
Wow. Wow. And what was the culture around birth control at the time?
Yeah, so birth control was illegal in Massachusetts, and it was illegal in a number of other states too. So at the time, there was only something called the rhythm method allowed, where you basically time intercourse around a woman's menstrual cycle. But Rock really believed in letting his patients, these women, have the information they needed to control when they became pregnant. He actually kind of went rogue and taught his med students about birth control.
As far back as the 1930s, he taught a course called something like Primate Development, which was really a course in how to give birth control. It was about diaphragms and all the birth control methods that worked. So it's not like they weren't doing it, but it was against the law.
So that is Margaret Marsh. She is a historian of medicine at Rutgers University. And essentially what she's saying is birth control is technically illegal, but people were working around that legal question to do what they needed to do in their own lives. And doctors were helping them, including John Rock, who was a devout Catholic.
Now, how did that impact their research?
Yes. So as soon as they realized that this was birth control, these hormones were stopping ovulation, they immediately had to go elsewhere. There are correspondence from the Times, letters where they're kind of scrambling to figure out where to go. They considered Japan and Hawaii, but they end up going to Puerto Rico. There are a couple reasons for this. And the biggest one is that birth control was legal there, and it had been legal for a long time.
And for the women who participated in the studies, how much information were they given? And did they receive any kind of compensation for being part of the trial?
Yeah, great questions. So at the time, there was no regulations around giving people informed consent or telling people about the research. There was kind of a recommendation, but that was generally not practiced. So that's just the historical backdrop. In Puerto Rico, it's a little less clear exactly what happened, but we know many of the women who participated did so eagerly, but it is not clear that they knew this was an experiment. They knew this was a new medication. They knew this was birth control, but whether they knew this was a clinical experiment, a study, is unclear. Also, the dosage back then was many times what it is now. So there were very severe side effects, things like nausea, dizziness, vomiting. It's not clear that they were informed that that would happen. And also, when they reported it, those side effects tended to be dismissed.
Wow.
There's one other thing I should note. In Puerto Rico, the political context at the time is key because this was a very controversial trial. The Catholic clergy spoke out from the minute it started against this trial, and political groups, particularly independence groups, were speaking out against this trial, saying, don't use our women as guinea pigs, was kind of the language they were using. So this was incredibly controversial, although there is evidence that many women were very eager to have something that would allow them to control when they got pregnant.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. Has there been any sort of reckoning with that history?
So the current movement to take the pill over the counter has been very well aware of this fraught and complicated history. And when I spoke to members of that effort, kind of the folks who spearheaded it, they told me that because of this history, reproductive justice advocates were involved from the very beginning of this campaign. Belle Taylor McGee is an activist who has been there since the early days. And this is what she told me.
Well, not only did we have voices at the table, we brought people on as members of the steering committee.
And it's not often that you have reproductive justice advocates at the table driving the campaign.
Mm-hmm. So this campaign is an effort to make birth control available in the U.S.
Yes.
Are there other countries where birth control is available without a prescription?
Yes, many, 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 many. More than 100 countries already have made birth control available over the counter. One of the main reasons that the U.S. has not done that so far is because, according to advocates and folks who worked on this campaign, it was very hard to find a pharmaceutical company that was willing to sign up and do the necessary studies that the Food and Drug Administration requires to take a pill from a prescription pill to an over-the-counter pill.
Why is that?
When I asked them, they said some of the pharmaceutical companies were afraid because of the fight that ensued around taking Plan B over the counter. And also they said women's health just wasn't a priority for many of the pharmaceutical companies.
Wow. Another question I have is, the political movement around abortion access is huge, right? And I feel like birth control is not that far away. So how come there isn't a bigger political movement around making oral birth control more accessible?
Yeah. So one of the things that's striking to me is that actually both Republicans and Democrats have stood up and supported the switch to an over-the-counter medication. And that is striking given how contentious abortion is and how much that has driven the parties apart into their separate camps. But this has actually not driven the two parties apart. And there are a couple reasons for why there is not a bigger political pushback or opposition to taking it over the counter. One of those reasons is that Republicans point to this as a free market solution to some health insurance and healthcare needs. Another is that it has divided anti-abortion or pro-life organized political groups because the Catholic Church opposes hormonal birth control, but evangelicals within their community and the folks I've spoken to tend to use birth control plenty, and there is not an organized stance against it. So because it's divided those organizations and they don't have a unified stance, they haven't put their political muscle behind opposing birth control that's available over the counter. I spoke to Elizabeth Janiak, an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and she told me that one reason that there isn't much opposition is because of how common the pill is.
Because it's so widely used and because has been used for so long. Pretty much everyone either has used the pill or knows someone who has, and so we can all kind of say from our own personal experience, yeah, this drug seems perfectly safe to me.
I will say there is one point of contention when it comes to whether the pill should go over the counter. It's whether there should be an age restriction, whether this should be available to anyone who grabs it off the counter, or whether it should be behind the counter and a pharmacist has to check your ID, even if you don't need a prescription, just to check your age. Now, many of the advocates who are pushing for this say you cannot have an age restriction because that requires you to have an ID and it requires you to interact with someone, and all those are barriers to getting access. The other side says you don't want children taking birth control without their parents' knowledge.
Well, Gabriella, when will we know if U.S. drug regulators have approved over-the-counter birth control?
Yes, the decision is expected this summer. I hear rumors about July, but we won't know until there's actually a decision.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you will give us the story when the decision comes down, so we'll keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, Gabriella, thank you so much for coming through to The Common. It is always a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, good to talk with you too.
That's WBUR Senior Health and Science reporter Gabrielle Emmanuel. And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you have any thoughts on this episode about birth control and the effort to make it available over the counter, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR The Common, or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.